The United States has invaded and colonized numerous islands, territories, and countries over its almost 250-year tenure as a nation. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Africa became the target of colonization by numerous countries. Europeans literally scrambled to claim land and exploit the continent's resources and people for profit. No other region of the planet has ever been colonized at the rate Africa was during this time period. Surprisingly, the U.S. was not one of the colonizers. So why didn't the United States join in the scramble for Africa? The reason is not what you might think. Many in the United States refuse to believe that their democratic republic would ever colonize and oppress people in other parts of the world, similar to how Britain had done to the 13 American colonies. But that's exactly what it's done over the years. Interestingly, the U.S. fits all the characteristics of an empire. The United States still holds island territories such as Puerto Rico, American Samoa, and Guam. All of these territories are technically part of the United States, but don't have the same rights or receive the same aid that the states do. Basically, U.S. territories are just a different name given to lands that are U.S. colonies. Traditionally, colonies are used to provide resources or a source of income to the nation that colonized it. This is what drove the colonization of Africa, and the United States followed this practice in parts of Latin America and the Pacific. But why didn't the U.S. ever try to colonize territories in Africa when it was clear at the time that such a venture would be lucrative? Before we can answer this question, we need to examine who ended up colonizing Africa and why. This, along with what was happening in the U.S. at the time, is the key to answering this intriguing question. The Scramble for Africa is the name given to the time period between 1885 and 1914 when European powers began rapidly colonizing the continent. Up to this point in history, there were only a handful of small colonies along the coast of the continent set up by the Portuguese and the Dutch. Most of the ports and European settlements in Africa were used as staging grounds to transport African people across the Atlantic during the slave trade. This was by far one of the darkest periods in human history. As more and more countries in Europe abolished the use of slaves and slave trading became illegal across much of the planet, nations needed a new source of income. Simultaneously, without free labor, the prices of goods started to increase. This led European powers to start looking toward the largest and most importantly closest continent with uncolonized land in the world, Africa. As colonies in the Americas continued to rise up against their European rulers on the other side of the Atlantic, these territories began to be seen as more trouble than they were worth. Due to the difficulty of maintaining colonies that were an ocean away, European powers began to focus on the largely unexplored continent directly to their south. However, there were several problems with exploring the middle of Africa, such as the vastness of its deserts, the denseness of its jungles, and the lack of infrastructure on the continent. This meant that for the most part, European explorers had pretty much always stayed close to the coast. However, by the 19th century, more and more private ventures were launched into Africa for a variety of reasons. The African Association, created by several extremely wealthy Englishmen, funded an expedition into the middle of the continent to locate the fabled city of Timbuktu. A byproduct of this expedition was the charting of the Niger River, which would later be used by future expeditions to penetrate further into Africa. As time progressed, the exploration of Africa shifted from trying to locate lost cities to looking for resource-rich regions to colonize. The United States during the same period was doing the same thing as European powers were. However, for the most part, they stuck to exploration of the western part of North America. After the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, the U.S. had more than doubled its territory seemingly overnight. There was a lot of land to inventory and resources to take stock of. Slavery was still legal in the U.S., and although the country had ambitions outside of its own borders, the only importance the early U.S. put on Africa was the main source of slave labor. The wealthy corporations and American government had no interest in exploring the African continent or colonizing its lands when there was so much to do at home. However, European countries needed resources desperately to keep up with the demand of both their wealthy and middle-class citizens. Since there was very little undeveloped land left on the European continent, they needed to look elsewhere to find the resources needed to keep their economies running. The dense and growing population of the continent had all but used up its limited resources, which was one of the reasons that Europe needed colonies so desperately. Although the U.S. itself did not play a role in the colonization of Africa, one of its citizens did. In the second half of the 19th century, Henry Morton Stanley, who would later become a naturalized American citizen, was tasked with finding Dr. Livingstone in the deep jungles of Africa. To be fair, Stanley was actually working for King Leopold II of Belgium, not the United States, during his exploration of Africa. At the same time he was searching for Dr. Livingstone, Henry Morton Stanley was also given the assignment to secure treaties with local chieftains along the Congo River to create a Belgian colony in Africa. The Belgian government did not have enough money to fund a large-scale colony in Africa, which led them to only secure the Congo. However, other countries in Europe did have the means and the money to stake claims in the African continent. Stanley's expedition brought the word back to Europe that there was opportunity there, leading other governments to send their own envoys to secure land on the continent. As the 19th century neared its end, the American Civil War led to the abolishment of slavery in the U.S., leading slave trading companies in Europe to pivot their strategies to more legitimate forms of trade. The United States had been torn apart by the Civil War and would spend the next several decades rebuilding the country and expanding its territory further to the west. This would eventually lead to a war with Mexico, which would result in more land being acquired by the U.S. What this meant was that the U.S. was concentrated on colonizing North America and couldn't care less about what was going on in Africa. European nations, on the other hand, saw the African continent as a new venture where they could make large sums of money by setting up plantations for cash crops, which could then be shipped back to Europe and around the world. The products they were after included rubber, coffee, sugar, and timber, among other goods that could not be procured in Europe. But perhaps one of the biggest reasons that this was the perfect time for European nations to colonize Africa was due to advances in transportation, in particular the advancement of steam engines, which allowed for faster train and ship travel. Iron-hulled vessels and steamships could now navigate shallower waters, allowing them to travel along the rivers of Africa. This, combined with the construction of railroads across the continent, allowed for easier transportation of goods to the coast, where they could be sent back to Europe. Advances in propulsion were not the only new technology that allowed Europeans to colonize Africa. Deadlier weapons were designed, and groundbreaking advances in medicine meant that malaria could be treated, allowing Europeans to survive the harsher environments of Africa. Up until this point, Africa had been known as the white man's grave due to the high mortality rates from malaria and yellow fever on the continent. These advances allowed Europeans to not just explore but thrive in Africa. Between the 1880s and 1920s, European countries carved out colonies in Africa, ravaged the lands, and exploited the people living there. It was a different kind of atrocity than the slave trade, but an atrocity nonetheless. By the early 20th century, 7 different countries had colonies in Africa, but the United States wasn't one of them. Or was it? Although the US did not colonize Africa the same way as nations of Europe did, saying the US didn't have any colonies on the continent is not entirely accurate. In 1847, the United States founded a small colony in Africa. The purpose of this colony was not to acquire slave labor or to exploit resources. Instead, a group of white Americans founded a corporation called the American Colonization Society that had one goal: resettle black people back into Africa. They planned to do this by founding the colony of Liberia. Make no mistake, the ACS was not helping black people return to their homeland out of the kindness of their hearts. In reality, they had some pretty messed up reasons for creating their colony in Africa. The American Colonization Society was created as part of the plan to deal with what they considered a problem brewing in the United States of America. That problem was free black people. Many people believed there was no way that free blacks and whites could coexist in a society. Obviously, this was a terrible and incredibly racist way to think. The crazy part was that many of the people who thought this way and were founders of the ACS were abolitionists. The American Colonization Society was made up of a group of white men with differing ideas about black people. The organization consisted of both slave owners and abolitionists, and as time progressed, many of the latter eventually rejected the idea that black and white people would never be able to coexist in society together. However, this did not stop the ACS from eventually starting their colony in Africa. The organization was made up of some very powerful and rich men who made sure that the colonists were well supplied. In 1818, the ACS sent 2 representatives to Western Africa where they would negotiate with local leaders on the price of their land. 2 years later, 88 free black settlers from the United States, along with 3 members of the American Colonization Society, set sail for Sierra Leone, where they bring a signed constitution to ensure the new colony would be settled under U.S. laws. The first spot that the new colonists landed was Cherbourg Island, just off the coast of Africa. Unfortunately, the colonists were ravaged by malaria and many died. Then in 1821, a United States naval ship carrying more settlers made it to the coast of Africa and continued the mission of the ACS. Upon disembarking from the ship, the colonists began looking for a more permanent settlement. They decided to set up shop in present-day Liberia. The native peoples initially refused to sell their land to the Americans, but eventually a naval officer wore down one of the chiefs who agreed to sell them a strip of land. The Navy moved the colonists that remained on Cherbourg Island to the newly acquired territory that would become the only U.S. colony in Africa. However, not everyone wanted them there. Local tribes continually attacked the colonists to the point where they had to build fortifications around their settlement. When their